and I'm going to ask you an impossible question, but I can't help it after listening to Luke Donald talk.
All right.
Can you tell me, like, in the chronology of the Ryder Cup, in the history, and its growth, it's gotten to the point we're at now.
Yeah.
What are, like, the three biggest moments? What are the posts, the guideposts?
Three biggest moments? That is.
Yeah, from where it came to where it is today.
That is nearly impossible. If I had to break it down into three moments in the time that we have left, I would say number one for me would be the first one. You got to start at the beginning. 1927 was the first Ryder Cup. It was held at the Worcester Country Club in Worcester, Massachusetts. It's interesting because you know the little guy that's on top of the Ryder Cup trophy? That golfer is actually modeled after Abe Mitchell. Abe Mitchell was Samuel Ryder, the seed merchant, the namesake's personal golf coach. And he was going to be the first captain of the GB&I, the Great Britain and Ireland side, but he got ill prior to, and Ted Ray took over. And Ted Ray was, the way I described Ted Ray would be, at his prowess, he was at top peak of his prowess. He was the John Daly at his peak of the game at the time. Big hitter and larger than life character. So he was the first captain. The American side, the first captain was Walter Hagen. And it's important to mention that because Walter Hagen was a playing captain, if memory serves me, 5 times, and then an additional time as just captain, so 6 times total. The key with Walter Hagen is to understand that the number one most important individual in the entire history of the Ryder Cup is Walter Hagen. Walter Hagen, more so than Samuel Ryder, the seed merchant, the namesake. Walter Hagen was the visionary that saw what this could be and what it eventually became. In the early days, Walter Hagen even funded like uniforms and things out of his own pocket so that the American team would be able to compete. And up until the First World War, it was nip and tuck between the two teams. After, of course, the Second World War, when Europe and England in particular were just devastated through the bombings and through the violence, after that, the American side dominated. So going back to Worcester Country Club, the reason why it was significant because Worcester was the site of the 1925 U.S. Open. And so there is this tether between the start of the Ryder Cup and Bobby Jones that a lot of people don't know about. That 1925 U.S. Open, that was where Bobby Jones called a penalty upon himself. When addressing his ball in the rough in the left side of the 11th hole in thick rough, he said the ball moved. He was playing alongside of his arch rival, the aforementioned Walter Hagen, if you can believe this. And so Bobby Jones said, I'm going to assess myself a penalty. Rules officials came over because it was the great Bobby Jones. They're like, whoa, let's think about this. And they asked Walter Hagen, did you see anything? He said, no, I didn't see anything. Bobby, please don't do this. Right? They asked people in the gallery, what would today be the rope line, did you see anything? Everybody said no. Regardless, Jones was resolute. He assessed himself the one-stroke penalty. Ultimately, he goes into a playoff against journeyman pro Willie McFarlane, and McFarlane wins. When all this was going on through the fray, the journalists, the media were asking Bobby Jones about what he did and why he did it, and this was such a noble move. And Jones quipped, and I'm paraphrasing, you might as well praise a man for not robbing a bank. That's Worcester Country Club. That was the stage at a national level that it was elevated to because of that event. So it was the perfect venue in the Northeast for the first Ryder Cup. That would be number one to me. Number two, this is very hard to do, Dominic. Number two, I would say, would be when GB and I were joined by Continental Europe. So that was that 1979 Ryder Cup. Now, this happened because of the vision of Jack Nicklaus. And Jack Nicklaus always has this ability to seemingly peer into the future. He did it in 1969 with the concession to Tony Jacklin when it resulted in a draw. Now, the Americans still kept the Ryder Cup then. But Nicklaus saw that the event was bigger than just wins and losses. He knew how important it could be to the game of golf. And so he conceded that last putt to Jacklin, saying that I never would have given you a chance to miss it. Again, paraphrasing the conversation between he and Tony with a putt when they were both together. I had them both in front of me one time and asked him how long the putt was. And Jack went about like, is my arm in this frame? Kind of like this. And Tony kind of went like this. So it was interesting that the variance a little bit in the distance. But generally, I've heard about 2.5 feet. So Jack Nicklaus was saying through the 70s, you know what? We need to get continental Europe in it. It was only furthered as this prodigy Seve was coming along. So in 1979, it's the first time on the U.S. side, it was Billy Casper was the captain that year. It was the first time that continental Europe joined GB&I and became this new European Ryder Cup team. Seve was on that squad. Only Seve ran into Larry Nelson. Here's Larry Nelson from a few years ago on the show.
We ended up getting Seve, I think, 4 times.
Yeah.
With different, I think he had a couple of different partners, but we played him just by the luck of the draw, played him 4 times, beat him all 4 times. And then I got him individually for the final, the individual day, and ended up beating him, I guess, 3-2. So it was one of those things that nothing outside bothered me. For some reason, I'm able to focus, or was able to focus, on what was at hand.
So here, 1979, Europe with Seve, and you just heard from Larry Nelson, they get crushed. 1981, they go up against what probably the greatest United States Ryder Cup team of all time. They get crushed again. Then the European side loses their main sponsor. So things were looking pretty dire here. It was looking like, there's still a risk that the Ryder Cup may not continue. And that brings me, Dom, to my, I would say, point 3, which would be Tony Jacklin. Tony Jacklin is the father of the modern Ryder Cup, and he still doesn't get the credit that he deserves with that. So after these crushing defeats on the GB&I side still, because they were the one administering it, even though it was a combined team with continental Europe, they go to the multiple-time major champion in Tony Jacklin, the recipient of the concession in 1969, and they go, Tony, we'd like you to captain the Ryder Cup team. Bear in mind, and this is the piece where elements of history tend to fall through the cracks of the pages. People don't realize that Tony Jacklin was on the outs with the Ryder Cup. He was done with it. Seve Ballesteros was done with the Ryder Cup. Ballesteros he wasn't on the 81 team because of a dispute over appearance fees. So when they came to Tony Jacklin, Jacklin was as surprised as anybody, but Jacklin wanted to make sure that if I'm going to do this, there's certain things that have to happen. And the first thing that has to happen for the first time since the Second World War is we need to make sure that when we show up, we feel like our presence there is no different than our counterparts in Americans who always come in polished and getting anything and everything that they could seemingly want on that side. Whereas on the now continental Ryder Cup team, or European Ryder Cup team rather, they're coming in scraping and clawing for whatever scraps they can possibly get. That was point 1. Point 2 was getting Seve back on the team. I'll get to that in a second, because first I want you to hear about how Tony saw his becoming the European captain went down.
Also, they banned Seve from playing in 81, and he was arguably the best player in the world. And I didn't think they wanted to win the Ryder Cup very much, not because they left me out, but because they left Seve out. The fact that they left me out teed me off somewhat. And God knows what Seve felt like. But I was done with the Ryder Cup. And that was that. And I never thought any more of it. I said, well, that'll do me. And
Seve was effectively done too, if I remember.
No, that's
correctly.
right. He was angry with officialdom. We both done with it. And they left picking the captain in 1980 for the 83 matches until 6 months before the matches were played. Because I didn't realize this till years after, but there was this argument behind the scenes that historically a captain had been a generation or more older than the team members. And Bernard Langer especially was arguing for somebody closer to the age of the players to be captain. In fact, he was pushing for me. And in the end, that's what happened. They came and asked me if I wanted to do it or would do it.
Were you surprised?
Well, you could have knocked me down with a feather, I'm telling you. I like I say, I'd done with it. And I nearly, if I'd have given them an immediate reaction, it would have been clear off. But it was an opportunity, so I slept on it that night. And there were things that weren't right behind the scenes. I mean, we were traveling at the back of the bus. Americans were traveling on Concorde. We were wearing anything anybody would give us. They had the best of everything. And self-esteem wise, the American team, they were 2 up before we had a golf ball. We didn't have a team room, for example. We were left to go off with our wives or partners to local restaurants during the week. If, once we were told who we were playing with in a sort of corner of the locker room, the next morning. And the team room was a very big deal as well. So I said, well, I'll do it if I get carte blanche to do what I want. So I started to list all these things: Concorde, Kashmir.
You just wanted equivalency with your opponents.
Yeah, and they kept saying yes.
All right, so that was so critical that Tony Jacklin could build that foundation. But you heard me mention, for context, because he came in talking about it, Seve. To get Ballesteros back on the team, though, was another matter entirely. He caught up with him. He had been named captain now. It was an early morning breakfast meeting with Seve.
He was venting for the first sort of half hour, as you would expect. And I said, I know, Seve, I agree with you. They're a shower. They're a complete shower. But we don't have to worry about them anymore. I've got carte blanche, and I've said I'll do it, but I can't do it without you. I have to have you on board. But I didn't have to stroke him for long. He was fantastic. He said, okay, I help you. At the end of that breakfast. And he was back in. And I'm telling you, you can draw a line across Ryder Cup history from that moment forward. I mean, we nearly won this thing.
So the significance of the line that Tony Jacklin was talking about there is that since 1979, Europe has won 12 times. Europe has only won 14 times overall. 12 times since 1979. So that line was critically important. He got Seve back on the European side, and he is still absolutely the spark of inspiration for the European team to this day. What was it like competing against Seve? It was tough. Here's the great Lanny Watkins, who could be one of the greatest American competitors of all time, and he played on 8 United States Ryder Cup teams, plus he was a Ryder Cup captain, with this story about competing against Seve.
Well, it was Manuel Panera. I had played the first day at the Belfry. I think it was 85. It was Mark's first Ryder Cup. I played the first day with Raymond as my partner in that bed. And we had won both matches. And I got into it. Let's just say I was, the guy that was getting excited, jumping around, fist pumping, everything. I was pretty much there. So the Brits didn't like me a lot. And that was fine. Got to the first tee. They booed us. O'Meara turned about as white as a sheet. Like, I said, yeah, don't you love it? Let's go get them. Well, we all headed down the fairway, won Belfry. Mark and Manuel Panera were a long way from the hole. They ran their putts up, picked them up. I've got about 25 feet for birdie. Seve's about 12 feet in my line. And I had him move his coin. And I pulled the putt, literally pulled the putt. It hit his coin, kicked right, and it went in the hole. He went ballistic. I mean, Seve, it was always looking for an excuse to get in your face. I played him 4 times in Ryder Cup. I was 4-0 against him. You just had to know that you don't put up with any crap from Seve. So I got right back in his face when he yelled at me about pulling the putt. I said, yeah, Seve, I'm that blanking good. Don't forget it. And that was the way it started. O'Meara and I ran the tables. We had him 6 down and 6 to play at one point.
It's absolutely classic from Lanny. 4-0 against Seve. So all of this leads to where we are today. And when I think the switch was actually thrown was at the 1991 Ryder Cup. I'm not going beyond the three that I gave you, Dom. Those are the three most important events in the history of it. But in 1991, Dave Stockton was a USA captain. And I asked Dave whether this was a turning point.
Maybe it's the first time it played out because we hadn't had the cup back in 6 years. And 4 years prior to that, when Nicklaus got beat on his own golf course in Muirfield, due to his own fault, I mean, he was the one that pursued this thing of, okay, Great Britain and Ireland, we're kind of getting them every time. And when I played in 71 and 77, it was basically a foregone conclusion under J.A. Barron and St. Louis, and then under Dow Finsterwald and Lytham and St. Anne's in 77. And all of a sudden, Jack has this vision, and Jacklin played a part in it, I'm sure. We'll play Europe. We'll play, Great Britain and Ireland and Europe, put them all together. And all of a sudden, it was an even Steven.
So outside of the three things I gave you, Dom, I've also mentioned 1969. I've also mentioned 1991. I think 85 and 87 were important because of European winning for the first time, Europe winning in the United States for the first time in 1999 when the USA came back at Brookline.